Thanks everyone. Welcome to this session. Really appreciate you giving me some time on an afternoon. Bit of a small crowd. I hope we'll have some fun. There's nothing more fun than operations in my experience, so this is all good. The session today is called Rock Solid Ops in 90 Days. So what I'm going to be taking you through, it's a 200 level session. I'm going to be taking you through some of the strategic themes you need to think about to get your operations right on AWS. And it's not going to go too much in depth on any one service, but I will give a shout out to one of my favorite services, which is AWS Managed Services. So you want an easy way to do operations, talk to James Windsor over here about our AWS Managed Services product, which is awesome. Alrighty, so a little bit about me. I've been at AWS just over 5 years. I actually joined in the professional services team. Shout out to Paul O'Rourke, who runs professional services for APAC, and Natasha as well, who's the public sector ProServe lead for New South Wales. So you've got some of the ProServe people in the room with you today. I'm now in an SA role, and I help one of the large telco customers figure out their cloud journey and what they want to do. I just want to leave you with three things today, which is that in terms of operations, it's really thinking about how you want people to use your environment, the kind of workloads and use cases you want to support, and making sure that you've considered how the operations are going to make those use cases happen. You're going to have to automate if you want to be really good at cloud. So whatever you do in your first 90 days, you've got to have a strategy about automation. And I'm going to talk about some key things you need to get right there. And everything is at your fingertips in terms of the platform already. You have everything available to you. So it really isn't a question of having to reinvent the wheel. Talk to your partners, talk to your ProServe about some standard constructs that you've got for doing your operations. We have everything in the platform for you. Let's start by actually thinking about what our operations are meant to do. And when I go and talk to customers about their first 90 days, my very first question to them is always, what are your users actually trying to use the cloud for? And what's interesting with cloud is there are two primary use cases, generally, that you're going to have to support with your operations. You've got the innovation use case, analytics, doing something new, and then you've got what we call retiring technical debt. So taking what you already have and moving that onto the cloud and improving it in some way. Now, the key point about this slide is you need to support both of those use cases. So whatever operations you're going to have to do, you need to think about how am I going to operate to support both of the ways of working here? And do the operations need to be the same? Do I have the same operations supporting my legacy technical debt workloads, and do I have the same operations supporting my innovation? So that's the first question to answer, right? What are we trying to do on the cloud? What's interesting about this slide is if you think about the value you're going to get out of using the platform, the innovation use case is quite linear. More and more people will start using the cloud, and they'll start doing more and more interesting things, and they'll start getting more and more value. But with the retiring technical debt kind of use case, you only tend to start realizing value once you start moving at scale. So it's really important that the operations are geared towards helping move as much as you can onto the cloud and start unlocking that value. There's two things that your operations need to focus on to make that migration at scale happen. Making sure the environment is secure, cost-controlled, reliable, performs well, that's table stakes. If you can't make the AWS environment be operated that way, no one will want to use it. But you've also got to delight the consumer. Now, AWS is part of Amazon. We're very much a retail organization. Consumer delight is at the heart of what we do. But one of the things I'd like you to walk away from today when you're thinking about how to build your operations are, who are the people who are going to use these operations, and how can we give them a better user experience than what they've got at the moment? So try and keep that in mind as we go forward. This slide here is interesting. This is some stats from a large migration customer. And these are the kind of outcomes and results that they would have from migration. What's interesting for us as operations people is not so much the sort of bottom line numbers, but it's numbers like the 98% reduction in priority one or high severity cases. So a good question to start out would be, what are the kind of so what questions are we going to answer with our operations when we build them? So reducing the amount of severity one incidents should be an absolute must that you're trying to achieve. Some other interesting ones here is 15 automated bots deployed. So, thinking about the kind of automation you're going to deploy, a bot is just a simple program that's going off and doing a task again and again. That is saving weeks' worth of effort from someone. So that's another really interesting part of the outcome of good operations should be how do we save people's time and get them doing more interesting stuff than patching servers or raising change requests or doing design reviews. Another interesting one is the reduction in compute assets. So as I use cloud effectively, I actually reduce the overhead or the number of assets I've got to manage. And I can squeeze that down and make that much more manageable. Each of those compute assets has a cost overhead in terms of operating it. So we just need to have a really clear view on how we're going to make that happen. So on our 90-day journey, what are some of the first things we need to think about? Well, one of the sort of three questions I always look at is what operational user experience should we want to provide? So as we talk about operations, we think about operations. Remember, we've always got the suppliers of those operational services. So this might be the people running incident management or the people running provisioning, and we've got the consumers of that service. One of the phrases we like to use in professional services always was, if the users think it sucks, it sucks. Meaning the user perception of how they view their operations is the reality of the efficiency of the service that's being provided. So a good example would be, if it takes me 5 weeks to provision a new service onto AWS, that's a really poor user experience. So we should always be thinking as we build our operations what we want the user experience to be. How do we measure our operational performance? Not sure if any of you have SLAs or KPIs for your operational services in the environment, but it's really useful to think about what KPIs would be meaningful in your first 90 days. So I'll give you sort of a couple to get started. How many times are support tickets for the cloud environment being reopened is a really good one, because it shows how well the support organization is actually supporting the cloud environment. How many failed changes are there in the cloud environment? And again, another nice kind of metrics. When you're building your cloud operations, be clear about those operational metrics and how you want them to work. And this is a really interesting test. After your 90 days of putting in your new operations, if you tripled or times by 100, say, the amount of people using your cloud platform, would you have to hire a bunch more people to go and operate it? Because if the answer is yes, you've probably done something wrong. You've built some bottlenecks or you've built some process inefficiencies in the way you've designed your operations. So we often see this where you've got some kind of ancillary team helping do the operations. For example, I see a lot of customers who have got on-prem large centralized network firewalls, where if I want to make a change to that firewall, I have to raise a change request and the firewall team go and action that. If you try that in the cloud environment, you'll just overwhelm that team if they're not automated in the way that they do their firewall management. So given those are the kind of questions we need to answer, I wanted to introduce the Well-Architected Framework to you. Quick show of hands in the room, who has used the Well-Architected Framework tool? A couple of people. People who are a partner of AWS don't count, unfortunately. So, okay, well, look, if you haven't, a great go-do would be go and look at this. Just do a search for it and have a look at the Well-Architected Framework. Well-Architected arose because our largest customers were saying to us, you need to give us better guidance on what best practice looks like for our applications. And it's typically used in the context of an individual application, working out if your design and your architecture is robust, secure, reliable, etc. It includes a pillar called operational excellence. So it actually consists of 5 pillars. One of those pillars is called operational excellence. We're going to use today to answer those questions I had earlier. But it has 4 others. And what's interesting is it only started out with the 4 on the right there. Operational excellence was actually introduced about 3 years ago, because what we realized was you really couldn't design your application properly and if you couldn't say how the controls that were going to be operationalized. So a good example might be, how do we do cost control for our application? How do we design it in a cost-effective manner? Well, we need some operational processes that are actually going to make that cost control happen. So if we're not operationally cognizant, we're not going to do those other pillars properly. So let's dive a bit deeper into operational excellence. These are the 6 pillars of operational excellence, and the 6 principles of operational excellence. So if I was going to review your operations, your operational services in the first 90 days, I would be testing them against each of these 6 principles to make sure they're working that way. So let's just run through them pretty quickly. If you're familiar with infrastructure as code, that you take the configuration of your environment and you describe it as code. Operations as code is basically taking it to the next level. And it's saying if you look at the operational processes you want to have in your cloud environment, you should be able to articulate them as code. So a simple example of how that might work would be, I want to patch my server. I want to patch my virtual server in the cloud. The action of doing that patching and managing that patching should be code, should be codified. So rather than log into the server and run some commands to patch it, I might use our systems manager product to actually go and schedule that patching. But then I don't just want to patch once. I want to have a schedule of patching every day or every month. So I can code that action as well. And I don't want to just patch one server. I want to patch every server in my AWS fleet. So again, I can describe and articulate that as code. So it is really important when you're building your operations, you build them as code. I should be able to describe them as code end to end. We must have accurate documentation for our environment. So this doesn't mean chucking up a few notes onto Confluence, right, of what's currently running in the environment. Every time we make a change, that change must be recorded. So we need to bake into our application development lifecycle all the changes that are happening to the documentation or the documentation of the environment. So a good example of this might be you should have an accurate record of all the assets in the environment. If I have to make a manual change to record those assets every time I change them, that would never work, that would never scale. So I might say to all the developers in the environment, every time you launch something, you also need to update the configuration management database and register the change to the asset, and that's how you properly maintain the environment. We must make frequent small reversible changes. So when we're operating the environment, the way the operations work should encourage the application teams to shrink the size of the change they're trying to make and make it easily reversible. So a good example here would be, you may say to an application team, look, if you can do blue-green testing, where you can deploy a copy of production, make the change to production, test that and demonstrate that to us, then you don't have to get explicit change approval before you make a change in the environment. That's how you should be operating the environment, encouraging your apps teams to do the same. You should be able to take feedback and update the operational procedures based on that fairly frequently. So feedback doesn't just have to be kind of metrics and KPIs. It could just be that you're talking to the consumers all the time and finding out how well the procedure or the process is working for them, and you're updating. So a good example might be your process for onboarding new users onto the cloud platform. If you look at that process and you start talking to people who've gone through that onboarding process and asking, did it take too long? Was the right training provided? How did we certify you? That's the kind of feedback you should be getting all the time for your operational processes to improve them. You should be anticipating failure, and the way your operations work should be anticipating failure. So this isn't just a question of testing, but you should be designing all of your applications to fail. Any of the individual components of the application should ideally be able to fail without impacting the application availability. So if you're familiar with the Chaos Suite products from Netflix, that's a really good example of that kind of capability. Chaos Monkey, Chaos Gorilla, that will go out and actually randomly turn off systems within the production environment or any environment, and you can tell from that how sustainable or how available the environment is. That's a good example of anticipating failure. And then we must learn from all operational failures. Interestingly, we have a process within AWS ourselves whereby any time there is a problem or an issue, we go through a fairly exhaustive process to find out why our automated systems did not anticipate or resolve that. And every post-incident review basically has to result in some new automation being released that would have prevented that situation happening in the first place. So there's quite a lot there. There's quite a lot of kind of principles to think about with your operations, but these are a good way of testing how robust those operations are when you build them. So let's look at the stages of operational excellence. So if we think about the kind of broad categories of services we're going to need in our first 90 days, they fall into these kind of three rough groups. We need to help prepare people to use operations. We need to help to operate the environment itself. And then we need to be able to evolve and improve. So actually, let's look at some of those in detail. So let's look at prepare. So if we're going to prepare the environment, what we need to do is first of all, let everyone know in the environment, let all the users of those operational services know what the requirement for operations is. We need to help them design for operations, so when they're building their applications or using those operational services, they're baking that into their application designs themselves. And then we need to have some assurance that these applications are ready to be built. So just to give you a sort of, bring it to life a bit, give you a sort of simple example. Let's say my application stops working when it's running on the cloud. I need some metadata to be applied to everything that application is running on to basically tell me how important it is, what I could do with it, who needs to fix it, all of those kind of operational functions. The first thing I need to do is let the application developers know that we must be applying metadata. And if you're familiar with AWS, we use tagging to do this, so the key pairs that apply to all our services. So how are the application teams going to know that they need to apply tags? How are they going to see what tags are available? How are they going to be able to create new tags? What kind of groups of tags from different teams should be applied? So those operational priorities, the requirement to perform tagging, we need to educate people. We need to make that really, really easy for them to do that. Then somebody needs to actually embed those tags when they're launching their products and services. So how are we going to make sure that the application designers are designing a tagging strategy for their applications? How are we going to help them understand the implications and the overheads of using different types of tags? For example, we have some customers who have a tagging strategy where there's a unique identifier for the application, which is then actually a database lookup which has a whole bunch of other individual data points around that identifier. Whereas some customers have lots and lots of individual tags saying, you know, business owner, business group, criticality, business service mapping, all of that good stuff. So we've done the design on our applications, but then we actually need to do some assurance that those tags are being applied. So we may have some compliance automation in place to say, as the application comes through for production, does it have tags applied? Are the right tags applied? Were the tags applied in the right way? So let's look at a sort of an example of how this might work in practice. So what we're using here is a service we have called AWS Config. So AWS Config is almost like a configuration management tool for your AWS services. And basically think of it like a video recorder of every change that was made on your service. And you can baseline or normalize each one of those changes and then start comparing it against rules. So what we've got going on here is we've got a pretty simple web application that's using some virtual servers, some databases, some identity management, some S3. Our config service is constantly looking at those configurations you've built and is creating baseline versions of those configurations. Every time I change those configurations, it's going to update that baseline. What I'm going to then do is create some rules, some rules that basically say if you see certain types of configuration, then perform some action. So a very common, or not very common, a configuration you certainly don't want to see, for example, is open access to your S3 environment to the public internet. So we could have a config rule that is constantly checking all of those configuration versions and then kicking off some bad thing happening if we see it in an open bucket. And we could kick off a notification, we could kick off a Lambda function to go fix it, we could actually take a snapshot of whatever the environment was. So you might have a situation, for example, when you say to the application teams, every time you try and promote something into production, you need to run your configuration against the config rules, and we're not going to let anything go to production unless it passes all of those tests. That's a good way of preparing. We haven't actually launched anything yet, but we've done a lot of operational kind of governance on whether something should be launched at all. So this is a good example of a kind of prepare function. And then we have the actual operate function itself. So you need functions that tell people what the operational health of the environment is, help them understand that, and then we need to respond to issues or events. So in the first 90 days, one of the things you would probably want to do, at the very least, is make sure every application running in the environment has a dashboard that shows you some health thresholds or health events or health alerts. This can be done very simply. We have a service called CloudOps, where you can set up all sorts of events. You can create a nice dashboard for the application team, and you then can create some thresholds, which will then go and do some action in response to that. So you'd certainly want to have that kind of dashboard, that kind of visibility. You also need to respond to events. So this is where it gets tricky. If we are responding to events and work in the environment that requires manual intervention or manual activity, it's going to be really hard for our operation teams to keep up. So a good example would be, does somebody have to manually review all the events in my environment and decide what to do with it, or have I set the automation rules up in advance? Let's have a look at what that might look like in practice. So this is an example of where we're using a service called AWS Health. AWS Health is an API where AWS will tell you about various things to do with your service that you need to know about. And one of the things it can do is, if we detect some of your credentials are starting to be abused, maybe they're being used for Bitcoin mining or something like that, we will tell you about that in your personal health dashboard. So what you might have is some CloudWatch events linked to those kind of alerts that we send you. What those CloudWatch events are going to do is then kick some automation off. And in this case, let's say AWS has discovered some credentials have been compromised. We are going to kick off a series of automation using our step functions and our Lambda services to, first of all, go and delete that credential that's been discovered, create a log or a trail of all of the activity that credential did, and then kick off some notifications so we can bring in the cybersecurity team and have them investigate. So without any manual intervention at all, we've logged the product, logged the problem, we've created a trail, we've alerted the right teams, we've shut it down. Now, if you were to think about the number of people that would be involved if you were to try and do that manually, you've got hours and hours of work, lots of communication across teams, may not work. So, are you going to be able to get to this overnight? Well, what I would do if I was starting a new operations capability is I'd be looking at all of the inbound tickets I'm getting from the environment, and every single one I'd be trying to create something like this that, had that been in place, it would have prevented me having to do something manually. And the last one is evolve, and this is actually probably one of the most important ones, because in your first 90 days, you're unlikely to get it right, and you're unlikely to know everything that you need to do. So we need to be doing two things. We need to have some products that help us learn from experience, or we have some services that help us learn from experience, and then we need to be able to find some way of sharing those learnings with other people. So how do we learn from experience? Well, one of the things that the operational services you create need to do is be very focused on metrics and understand trends and variances over time. So a good example might be, let's say you were the design team for your cloud platform, and you were looking at inbound design requests as an operational function of things that people wanted to provision in the environment. So you had all of these different requests coming in, and you found that the people were asking for the same type of architecture again and again and again. What you should be doing is then going and publishing some standard templates or some standard configurations. So the next time someone comes along, they can look at that service catalog and they can go and provision that template, and you don't have to go and approve it again. So that's the kind of learning from experience bit, but sharing it is also really important. And sharing can happen both in a sort of collaborative way. If any of you are familiar with the National Australia Bank public case study at the moment, where they've created a cloud guild, and the guild is almost like a very well-structured community of interest. I would say all of your operations need to have that. They need to have this community of interest of the people who are supplying those operational services and the people who are using them, so you can be sharing feedback. But you can also kind of institutionalize it. You can also actually make it programmatic. So let's have a look at how that might work in practice. So this is using our product called AWS Service Catalog. Now, if you may or may not be familiar with the concept of the service catalog, but it's actually a really important tool for constraining what can be done in the environment and making it easier for people to do the right thing. So with Service Catalog, what we can do is we can have a collection of CloudFormation infrastructure as code templates, and we can make those available to our users. And that's called a portfolio. So we can have a central Service Catalog with a portfolio of this is what good looks like as architectural constructs. And then we can have a number of spoke environments where people can take those, this is what good looks like, and create their own versions of that. So a really good example might be data warehousing. You may say, right, we're going to have a standard data lake or data warehouse product, and what we would like to do is let the different analytics team have a copy of that, and they can tailor it for their own security and their own particular use, and then go launch that. They're still working off that initial central version, but they've created their own versions of it. This is great because then they're not having to come back to you again and again for approval or some sort of query. They're always working off their local copy. Now, let's say we have a situation where we've found some improvements we'd like to make to the standard product or the standard service catalog portfolio everyone's using. That central team can take that feedback, iterate and improve the product, and then push it out to those spoke accounts. So we have that really strong concept of learning and then pushing it out and making it available to it. Now, one sort of important part of why Evolve is so important is that you're not going to get it right, and you're going to want to constantly improve the user experience. This kind of method is really, really useful way of doing that. So if you haven't got a service catalog, please go get one. Please start talking to us about how we can help you implement that. So that's a very, very quick overview of operational excellence and how it can work. One other key question to ask yourself, or one other question to consider is, who do you want to do all this? One thing that a lot of people try and do is think this is what we do at the moment, and this is how we do it at the moment in our existing environment, and so when we move to the cloud, we should essentially do the same thing. Really, from an operations perspective, you should be looking to have either AWS or a partner do as much as that for you as you can. So, certainly with your architectures, you'd always want to be consuming some of our managed services, either our actual AWS managed service or something like our DynamoDB service or our RDS service, something where you can push off that operational overhead to AWS in some way. And you would always be looking to do that. Or you go with one of our partner solutions where they can come in and do that for you as well. So always keep that in mind is what do we do and what can we get people to do for us. And the final call to action for you all, if you're not using AWS at the moment or you haven't experimented yourselves, nearly all of our services have a free tier. So you have the ability to go in and try this and experiment for yourself. Everything I've talked about today, you can go and do for yourself for free on AWS. And I strongly advise you to do that. We'll get a sense of what automation would look like or how you might build your operational services. Certainly go and look at the Well-Architected Framework. You can reach out to one of our partners or our professional services organization or our SA team and help you do well-architected reviews. One of the really powerful things you can do, for example, is as a part of your change management process is say to the application teams, you should be using the well-architected tool, which you can find in the console, to do self-service assessments against operational excellence. See how they answer those questions. Certainly you want to get really good at CloudFront. There are other products that also do infrastructure as code, but CloudFront is our product that does that. All of your operations, the way you speak to operations, the way the environment's used, should ideally be done through CloudFront because it gives you so many much powerful management, powerful management capabilities. So I've included a link to a really good masterclass on CloudFront, which is super useful. And then finally, definitely go and listen to the masters or people who run massive environments at scale and see how they do it. And Netflix are a really, really good use case to go and watch here because they've really pioneered some of the ways you can provide that continuous compliance, continuous operations assurance for your environment. So with that, I think that's a bit of a brain dump. Thank you very much. I'm happy to hang around afterwards. I'll also be out in the booth. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about your operations and how we can help you get started. Thank you.
Thank you, George.